Hi there, I'm Danita Westman, the well-rounded fiberista and your fiber arts teacher. I brought you the last few videos talking about tools to keep in your tool bag. We've gone over knitting notions and what to keep in your knitting bag, and we've also talked about what to keep in your spinning bag, what you want to keep handy that you don't want to have to get up and dig for when you're spinning, whether it's in your home or out and about. Today we're going to talk about what I like to keep in my notions bag for rigid heddle weaving. The tools are going to be a little bit different for floor loom weaving and rigid heddle weaving, and we'll talk a little bit more about what happens on those floor and table looms, those multi-shaft looms later. But for rigid heddle weaving, here is what I keep on hand all the time. The first thing that I have in my bag that is non-negotiable is a tape measure. And I talked a little bit in my previous video about retractable tape measures. This is a metal tape measure. This is a retractable metal tape measure. Metal's not going to stretch on you. So I'm a big fan. Actually, this one came from IKEA, like all the good things do. And these were really inexpensive. So even if somebody walks away with it, I can replace it for $1 or something. So metal, marked in both standard and metric. And my favorite thing about weaving is if you're trying to direct warp, it's got a lock button on it so that you can set the length of how far your back apron rod needs to be from your warping peg, and it won't shrink back up on you. You can set this down and lay out your space right as you go, and it's not going to run away from you. And then when you're done, you can release that lock and it swoops right back in. So definitely have a tape measure. I like to have a tape measure that'll go at least 10 feet for direct warping if I'm going to do more than one project on the same warp. So like towels, for example, if I'm going to do a run of hand towels, I like to pack as much on that back beam as I can possibly fit, and 10 to 12 feet should get you there. The next thing that I always keep in my bag is a nice pair of sharp scissors. That goes without saying. You can definitely use a pair of nippers like this one for trimming ends as you go, your tails, when you join in different colors or change shuttles when you're weaving. But a long pair of scissors like this makes for really quick work when you're cutting off that back beam when you're done. The next thing that is non-negotiable is a threading hook. Sometimes people call it a slaying hook too. So I like the double-ended style. There are other styles that only have the skinny end. These are sometimes called slaying hooks, I think, as well. And if this works, great. If this works, great. I like to use this end when I'm direct warping to go through when I'm pulling a loop through my heddle, and then I use the skinny end for threading that heddle. So this is my preferred. However, since they are so light and the color is so neutral, they tend to walk away. So have more than one of these around. The next thing that I keep in my spinning bag that is non-negotiable is a small ball of smooth, light-colored waste yarn. That's great for all kinds of things. It can mark your boundaries in your heddle, so you can center your work in your heddle and you don't have to count. You can just tie an extra loop, cut a little bit of this off, mark, tie a loop on the boundaries of where your work needs to go into your heddle. It's also great for waste yarn when you're spreading your warp at the beginning, securing your weaving at the end, so when you cut it off, you're not risking losing any of your woven fabric. I'm a big fan. This is a wool yarn. As you can see, it's got some stretch to it. I mostly work with wool, so having a wool waste yarn that has a similar character is helpful for me, and I recommend that my students keep some of that around too. The last thing that I have in my tool bag that's not a necessity, but it is handy to have, believe it or not, if you're a child of the 80s like I was, this is a blast from the past. Brace yourself. It's a hair pick. I know, but go with me here. It's a hair pick. Even though I don't have much hair to pick these days. I never had curly hair. I didn't have naturally curly hair. I only once had artificially curly hair, and even then I didn't know what to do with one of these things. Now, the reason I own them is because of my weaving. If you have a yarn that is very delicate or that has a lot of texture to it that you're using for your weft, sometimes bringing your heddle back to place your weft into your woven fabric, into your shed, can be a little too rough on it. Maybe it it squishes it too much. Maybe it catches on the texture in your weft yarn. There are lots of scenarios where maybe that heddle may be too rough, or is hindering your process more than it is helping it. And in that situation, you want to reach for a hair pick. So you can open your shed, pass your weft yarn through just like normal, and instead of using your heddle to place your weft into the shed, you can use a pick and just tap it into place right along side to side just like you normally would, and then change your shed with your heddle and keep going. So instead of bringing that heddle back, placing your weft, and then putting it in the opposite position, you'll place your heddle, use your pick, place your weft, change your shed every time. And if you're being opportunistic like I was, or if your husband already happens to be out running errands at the drugstore like mine was, you get a multi-pack of picks that has different shapes and sizes, and that all is helpful for what you're doing. And the thing that I like about these is you can see these teeth are about the same width apart on one side, but they get a little bit closer together at the end. So literally, here's your two different sets. So if you're working a wider set, you can use this one. If you're working a narrower set, you can use this one, and kind of tap those fine weft yarns into place. Like I said, not mandatory, but it is a nice thing to have if you've got them around. Hey, if you still have a vintage hair pick from the 1980s, use it. And also, good for you. You're more virtuous than I am. Those things got pitched a long time ago. About the time I did my last spiral perm in 1990. You know what? We're just not going to talk about that. We don't have to talk about that. The other thing that may be optional that you want to keep in your bag is a wraps per inch tool like this one. This one's from, as you can see, it's from Katrinkles. Not sponsored, just love. If you're working with something and you're not sure how it's working up, or you're not sure how you want to warp it, might be a good idea to stop what you're doing, grab your whips tool or your wraps per inch tool, and double check it and say, you know, maybe the yarn label says that it's this weight, but I'm not really sure. I don't know if I trust that. Always a good idea to do a wraps per inch check on that yarn to make sure that that yarn isn't going to lie to you, because once you get it into your direct warp, it can still be saved, but it's going to take you a lot of work, and you're going to work for that. Once you cut that yarn and get ready to thread it, it's going to be a lot trickier to try to save that warp if it's kind of lied to you about how thick or how sticky or how grabby it wants to be in your warp. So that's everything I have on hand when I'm warping, threading, and tying on to my loom. Those are the non-negotiable things. They all come out. They live in a bag with my warping pegs and my clamps, and all of that can go away after I'm done warping. When I'm actually weaving, I have a smaller kit that I keep on that hangs on the side of my loom stand, and I want to show you what those things are now too. Non-negotiable number one, a dressmaker's tape. Right here, so I can keep track of where I'm going, how far into my project I am at the moment. The next thing I like to keep on hand while I'm actually weaving is one of these guys. This is a gauge finder, and it's nice to have that 1-inch square to check my picks per inch as I'm working. If you've worked any of my rigid heddle patterns, you know that I always describe to you set as it is under tension on the loom, not the finished set of the woven piece, so that way you can check it as you go, and you don't have to wait until you've wet finished the fabric to know if you're doing it right or not. So I like to keep this always close nearby as I'm weaving, as I'm designing, as I'm teaching, always right there. The next thing I like to keep on hand is a pair of sharp embroidery scissors like these. You can see they've got a very sharp point. I like to keep those and my needle for weaving end ends in this little magnetic case. It was made by Namaste, and I think you can still get these now. The case is great because the scissors cannot pierce it, and my needle lives on the magnetic top here, and it won't go away, and it's just going to hang out right there where I need it to. The other thing that I use and I find really helpful are these numbered light bulb pin markers. They are also from Katrinkles. You can see I've got mine daisy chained. So there's number 1, and here's number 2, here's number 3. And so I have these light bulb pin markers that have numbers engraved on them from 1 to 20. And I put these down the side of my selvage as I'm weaving. And every 6 inches, I drop a number. So I know that if I look down and I see the number 5 down the side means that I'm at 30 inches woven from my original Spreading the Warp waist yarn. And I find that really helpful. I know some people will pin a tape along as they go, and that is an option, but it also makes a little bit of a lump because of the thickness of the dressmaker's tape, especially if it's a reinforced one. It's got thickness and it'll add a lump, and sometimes it can throw tension off. I know other people will use like a grosgrain ribbon marked, and that makes me nervous too because it can shimmy around. If you don't really pin it in securely, it can move and then you got nothing, and you have to take the tension off of your entire piece to go back to the beginning and then measure it. And so I really prefer using these little light bulb pin markers with the numbers right engraved on the side there, because then there's no question of how far that I've measured, and then I know that I'm measuring under consistent tension the whole time that I'm weaving. So that's what I keep on hand when I'm weaving on my rigid head of looms. What do you have? What do you keep nearby? What do you wish you'd kept nearby? What are the things that you keep to help keep you on track? If you have any tips or tricks, put them down in the comments below, and I hope to see you again soon. Happy weaving, and keep working with your fluff. The next thing that is non-negotiable is a little gauge tool. So I like to use this as I'm going to check my picks per inch as I'm weaving. You can see it's measured in. Here's what I found. The next thing I like to keep on hand in my the next thing